It's the late 16th century. After decisively defeating Safavid Persia, the Ottoman Empire turns its war machine towards Europe. Although officially at peace for nearly 3 decades, conflict has been brewing for years along the unstable Ottoman-Austrian border. Both sides keep looking for pretexts to launch frequent, large-scale raids into enemy territory. By 1591, clashes intensify along the Bosnian-Croatian border, and things finally come to a head in the summer of 1593. The war begins on July 29th. Although officially it was the Ottomans who declared war against Austria, both empires are in fact itching for a fight to extend their control over the Trans-Danubian and Carpathian regions. Numerous military operations mark the first years of the war, mainly for control over crucial fortresses along the Danube, with Ottomans maintaining firm dominance on the strategic level, poised to attack Vienna from the western Trans-Danubian sector that they firmly control. But the old Austrian capital is spared when the attack is postponed because of the death of Sultan Murad III and the ascension of Mehmed III to the throne. Another setback for the Ottomans is the unstable situation in the Carpathians, created by harsh economic pressures imposed by the central government. Namely, because of expensive wars with Persia and Austria, the Ottoman Empire needs vast sums to maintain its dominance in the Middle East and Europe. In addition, its army needs modernizing to keep pace with European powers. But because of the collapse of the Timar system, the expensive modernization has to be financed from the palace coffers. Consequently, the Ottomans impose heavy taxes in many parts of the empire, including the Carpathian principalities. For much of the 16th century, Wallachia and Moldavia, although nominally autonomous, are in reality oppressed Ottoman provinces. Their voivodes serve as mere tax officials for the Sultan. In the Ottoman legal system, such vassal states were referred to as tax farms. However, this higher taxation isn't felt as hard in Transylvania. In the 16th century, it is the richest and most urbanized of the 3 principalities with a thriving manufacturing sector. Strategically, it is in the outer reaches of the empire, protected by the Carpathian Mountains and many fortified cities. Transylvanian voivodes traditionally use this strategic position to bargain for lower taxes and better terms overall. In contrast, Wallachia and Moldavia are less developed. Their weaker economies are mainly structured around agriculture and cattle breeding. Furthermore, in exchange for being allowed to rule as vassals of the Sultan, their voivodes agree to tear down existing stone fortifications and are forbidden from building new ones, leaving their countries exposed to the Ottomans, who occupy fortified positions along the Danube, from where they can exert control over the 2 principalities, impose much heavier taxes, and launch frequent, devastating Akinji raids. What's worse, Turkish populations begin settling in Wallachian territory, building communities and mosques, thereby violating the Treaty of Nicopolis that prohibits this by the vassal status of Wallachia. Powerless to resist, Wallachian and Moldavian nobility in turn oppresses their own people throughout the 16th century as they try to appease the Sultan, lest they be replaced by a pretender more capable of meeting the higher taxation quotas. Economies of the 2 Danubian principalities are further strained as they are obliged to sell grain, cattle, and other produce to the Ottoman Empire at below market prices. And even this exploitation is overextended because of long and expensive wars, as well as the ongoing modernization of the army. Motivated by these harsh conditions, the 3 princes, Sigismund Bathory, Aaron the Tyrant, and Mihai the Brave, join the Holy League. And they promise each other to revolt on the same day, November the 13th, 1594. Of the three princes, Mihai will soon come to the fore as a military leader. Born on January 15, 1558, Mihai is the son of the former voivode of Wallachia, Petrasco the Good, and Theodora Cantacuzino. On his father's side, he traces his roots back to Vlad Dracul, the father of Vlad the Impaler, who, in turn, is Mihai's great-great-great-uncle. And through his grandmother, he is the great-great-grandson of Stefan the Great of Moldavia. On his mother's side, he belongs to the Byzantine Cantacuzino family. The prestigious family claims descendancy from the Byzantine Emperor John VI Cantacuzinus. Little is known about Mihai's upbringing, but in his 20s, he became one of the wealthiest people in Wallachian history, holding vast estates in Oltenia, personally owning more than 200 villages. He marries a wealthy Oltenian widow with whom he has one, possibly two sons, and a daughter. By the age of 35, he rises to political prominence, occupying several honourable positions in the state before eventually becoming the Ban of Craiova in 1593. Fearing Mihai's growing power, Prince Alexander III forces him to swear in front of other boyars that he is not of princely descent. By publicly humiliating Mihai like this, Alexander hopes to remove him as a potential rival to the throne. This, however, does not settle the issue. Mihai borrows from Turkish moneylenders in Wallachia and flees the country, fearing assassination. He travels to Constantinople, where he uses his political connections, but more importantly, his Cantacuzino ancestry, to secure even larger loans and persuade the Sultan to back him in his bid to the Wallachian throne. But Mihai has no intention of paying off his debts. Upon returning, he uses the borrowed money to gain support from the boyars and is elected Prince of Wallachia on October 11, 1593. Confronted with harsh terms imposed by the Ottomans, he makes a clean break with the past. Intent on taking Wallachia in a new direction, he will make a series of controversial decisions, for which he will be remembered as a heroic leader by some and as a treacherous tyrant by others. He replaces high-ranking officials with loyal supporters, mainly from his power base in Oltenia. And, after nearly 70 years of princes and boyars who were compliant towards the Ottomans, Mihai's Wallachia will fight for its independence. The Holy League promises to support the Wallachian revolt, knowing that it could open a second front against the Ottomans. So, with his position at home consolidated and the alliances in place, Mihai decides it's time to act. Pretending he wishes to settle financial debts, he invites Turkish creditors and, in an act of clear provocation, massacres them together with their large escort of soldiers. With around 8,000 troops at his disposal, Mihai then personally leads a swift attack on the key Danube crossing at Giurgiu. The town is taken and plundered, but the siege of the island fortress guarding the river crossing fails, as troops, ammunition and provisions are sent from the Ottoman side. Mihai returns to Bucharest after learning from his spies that a conspiracy against him is launched by adherents to the Turks, accompanied by a contingent of troops. He sets up an ambush for them, capturing and executing all of the conspirators. Determined to prevent similar future inroads into Wallachia, Mihai marches east, intent on clearing bridges and Ottoman garrisons on either side of the Danube. He successfully besieges important Ottoman fortifications and raids numerous towns and villages in the lower Danube area, leaving utter destruction in his wake, before returning back across the river. Further upstream, Mihai defeats the Ottomans again and takes the fortified town of Silistra, before reducing it to ashes, along with the surrounding countryside. Destruction of important border fortifications in quick succession causes great concern in Constantinople. The Sultan dispatches an army from the south under Mustafa Pasha and redirects a strong Tatar contingent from the Hungarian front to enter Wallachia from the west. The Tatars advance quickly toward the reported position of the Wallachian army. Little do they know that Mihai received word of their movement. He he secretly sends a small force west to set up an ambush while maintaining an appearance that his entire army is encamped just north of Giurgiu. Expecting to encounter Mihai further east, the Tartars fall straight into a trap while marching in a loose formation, losing nearly half of their troops. Mihai subsequently intercepts them and wipes out their army, preventing them from linking up with Ottoman forces approaching from the south. Meanwhile, Mustafa Pasha crosses the Danube to confront the Wallachian prince. Aware of the enemy's numerical superiority, Mihai reacts quickly. Just 4 days after defeating the Tartars, he leads a daring night attack into the Ottoman camp and routs Mustafa's army, forcing them into a disorganized retreat. He defeats the Ottomans in a pitched battle, killing General Mustafa. Mihai then embarks on a campaign of pillage and destruction. Wallachian troops show no mercy, storming several fortified cities, leaving countless towns and villages in ruins, with the civilian population suffering the most. Another Ottoman general, Hasan Pasha, takes over Mustafa's retreating army and attaches it to his own contingent. Mihai gives battle and completely destroys Hasan's army, killing the Ottoman general, along with the Crimean Khan's son that was accompanying him. Mihai then retreats back to Wallachia with a vast plunder. He comes to the aid of Aron the Tyrant in attacking Brela, Kilia, and other Ottoman positions. With the lower Danube area and the Danube Delta secured, supply lines to the Ottoman army in Hungary are virtually cut, which significantly slows their otherwise successful campaign against the Holy League. Mihai renews his attack, devastating parts of northern Bulgaria, pushing deep into Ottoman territory. At one point, he reaches within 1 day's march from Constantinople itself, before turning back after assistance from the Holy League fails to materialize. Many in the Ottoman capital begin referring to Mihai as king and even emperor, spreading rumors that he might take the capital at any moment. In order to tackle possible dissent, Ottoman authorities in Constantinople respond by expelling any non-Muslims who lived in the city for less than 5 years. Mihai's fame spreads across the continent. Many warriors, sellswords and mercenary companies flock to join him. Ottoman scholar Selanik Mustafa writes of the Great Destruction. All of our sanjaks are captured. We are ruined. The urgency of the situation is such that Sinan Pasha himself, the great mastermind behind the successful campaign against the Austrians, is recalled from Hungary to organize a counterattack on Wallachia. But Mihai has reasons to worry. While his campaign was certainly successful, having personally led his troops in battle, he saw firsthand that the Wallachian army is obsolete and in a deplorable state. Aside from contingents of Cossacks and Sekeli mercenaries, Wallachian troops are poorly equipped. There is a general shortage of horses, weapons, carriages, tents, and even food supplies, water and fodder. Furthermore, there is a problem with discipline and basic training among the troops. At night, passwords would be called out loud in the camps. Wallachian troops would view foreign mercenaries with suspicion, sometimes encamping separately and refusing to cooperate with them. Mihai realizes that he needs a professional army of mercenaries if he is to have any chance at stopping the efficient Ottoman war machine. But paying salaries for thousands of mercenaries and equipping them with firearms is extremely expensive. So expensive that the entire state of Wallachia cannot afford it. Nevertheless, Mihai puts his already weak Wallachian economy under stress in order to secure the necessary funding. He imposes much higher taxes on his subjects than the Ottomans did previously. In addition, he introduces a law that ties peasants to their landlords' estates in an attempt to avoid financial instability, thus effectively enforcing servitude upon his people. He takes away the liberties of countless free villages, turning them into dependent communities. Some communities attempt to buy their freedom and, ironically, the constant need for funds to pay for his mercenary army forces Mihai to accept the bribes, thereby invalidating his own laws. Needless to say, the high taxes, oppressive laws and corruption quickly make him very unpopular. but Mihai considers these measures necessary. Furthermore, he expands the alliance with Sigismund, effectively becoming his vassal in exchange for substantial military support. The terms imposed by Sigismund are much worse than those Wallachia had with the Ottomans before the war. Mihai's reasoning is that he needs military support now, and he would have agreed to any terms. With his numbers bolstered to around 15,000, Mihai takes up position on the Danube. Across the river, the Ottomans are amassing 100,000 combat and non-combat troops, intent on fully incorporating Wallachia into the empire. Operations to cross the river begin in July, but Mihai's guerrilla tactics delay their advance by a whole month before he is forced to retreat when Ottomans manage to establish a bridgehead. Mihai stops his army and makes a stand near Kalugareni. It's early morning. Mihai's camp is in a narrow valley, less than 2 kilometers wide. Hills and thick forests surround the Wallachian position on 2 sides. Numerous streams flow down into the Nyajlov River, forming a largely impassable swamp. A single road goes across a bridge through the swamp, connecting Giurgiu and Bucharest. Knowing that the Wallachian army is somewhere in the valley, Sinan dispatches scouts to find fords across the swamp and stops his column so the rest of his troops can catch up. The aggressive Mihai goes on the offensive, wanting to engage the Ottomans while only a part of their army is present. Sinan shores up his ranks and readies the men, just in time. The momentum of the charge initially pushes the Ottoman line back, but Mihai surprisingly begins a fighting retreat towards the bridge soon after. He keeps the Ottomans committed, giving more and more ground, forcing Sinan to send more troops to prevent the vanguard from being separated from the rest of the army. The retreat slows at a choke point near the bridge. Mihai's mercenaries inflict heavy losses on the enemy while they continue to pull back across the river, but the Ottoman vanguard is just as eager to press the advantage. As Sinan himself comes closer to the bridge, the Wallachian army on the other side comes into view. The enemy lured him into an ambush. Mihai's cannons open fire from the other side of the river. Ottoman troops are forced to march across the field under a constant barrage, while the vanguard's advance grounds to a crawl as they too are being bombarded. Seeing that some of his men are wavering, Sinan personally rallies the troops. With their general urging them forward, the Ottomans push the enemy back. Mihai responds by ordering more troops to descend on the crossing to hold the line. The deafening noise of the fighting drowns out orders from captains on either side. Meanwhile, Sinan's scouts return with good news. The way through the swamp is treacherous, but possible. The Ottoman general seizes the opportunity to envelop the enemy. He sends one contingent south of the bridge and orders another to find a way through the swamp and attack Mihai's right flank. At the bridge, sparring between the two armies continues, as neither side is able to break the stalemate. Mihai receives reports that an Ottoman contingent is attempting an encirclement from the south. Aware that he doesn't have the numbers to fight an open battle, Mihai reforms his left flank. He fires all of his cannons towards the approaching Ottoman cavalry. With a Wallachian line supported by artillery, Sinan's right wing abandons the attack while under heavy bombardment. At the bridge, the fighting also dies down as the exhausted troops disengage to catch their breath. Meanwhile, the Ottoman left wing is unable to find a way through the dense swamp. Around noon, Sinan launches a full-scale offensive, ordering Janissaries to attack the bridge and both flanks to envelop the enemy. Initially, it seems like the fighting near the bridge will be a repeat of the stalemate from earlier in the day, but Sinan orders trees to be cut down and placed over the swampy river around the bridge. Janissaries take advantage of the wider crossing and gain the upper hand. Meanwhile, some of the Ottoman artillery finally catches up. Sinan orders most of the artillery to support his cavalry on the right flank. Another 2 hours of fighting pass. Exhausted, the Wallachian line is on the verge of collapse. Fearing a rout, Mihai orders an organized retreat, abandoning 10 of his cannons to the enemy. The Ottomans soon give up their pursuit, as their troops are just as exhausted after fighting for hours in the midday summer heat. The afternoon wears on, and a thick fog descends on the valley. Sinan proceeds to send troops across the river. Mihai knows he must act. A few hours later, he orders a general attack, realizing that if the entire Ottoman army crosses, he will have no chance of defeating them. He puts his best troops in the front, sends a contingent of mounted scouts through the woods on his left, and places the reserves in the second line, positioning most of them on his right flank, anticipating an Ottoman envelopment from the west. Sinan is at first unable to see the enemy approaching, but news of the attack soon reaches him. Out from the fog come Mihai's first line of mercenaries. In a sustained attack, the Wallachians try to push the Ottomans back towards the bridge, but Sinan's troops prove their mettle and manage to hold the line. Aware that it is only a matter of time before the momentum of the Wallachian attack withers away, Mihai puts his life on the line, attempting to reinvigorate the men. He gathers his personal retinue and charges to the forefront of the fighting, throwing himself into the enemy line, cutting down several janissaries in a matter of seconds. This brave act has an immediate impact on the morale of his troops. The Wallachian army pushes forward, as if under a spell. Albert Kirai positions the 2 cannons under his command and fires at the Ottoman soldiers near the bridge. To the east, having weaved their way through the woods they know well, Mihai's scouts finally emerge and charge the enemy's right flank. For the first time, the Ottomans are on the back foot. Seeing that his men are losing heart, Sinan personally rides across the bridge to rally his men. His presence slows the Wallachian advance, but not before Mihai manages to recapture his 10 cannons. A barrage is unleashed on the mass of Ottoman soldiers at almost point-blank range. Meanwhile, Kirai fires his cannons at the Ottoman right flank. Pressed against the janissaries and taking heavy losses, Sinan's cavalry on the right routs, with Mihai's scouts pursuing them across the river. Sinan joins the fighting himself and orders an all-out charge. Ottoman troops rally around their brave general. An intense battle ensues, as neither side is willing to give in. In the melee, Sinan is thrown from his horse into the muddy river. His troops panic, believing that their general perished in battle. Some take flight across the bridge, while others risk wading through the dangerous swamp, desperate to cross the river. Amidst the chaotic fighting, it is some time before Sinan is helped back onto his horse. He reprimands his men for running away, hurling insults at them, demanding that they stand and fight. But it is too late. What little troops remain committed won't be able to check the Wallachian advance. He orders a general retreat. Mihai doesn't give chase, still threatened by the Ottoman left flank. But before the day ends, they too will be routed from the field. The battle lasted for about 16 hours. Wallachian losses are fairly light. Of the 15,000 troops under his command, Mihai lost about 1,000 men, most of whom fell in the final charge. Meanwhile, Sinan wasn't able to bring his full force to bear, and of the 30 to 40,000 troops that participated in the battle, between 10 and 15,000 perished. 4 pashas and 7 sanjak begs fell in battle. Much of the artillery and treasure from the camp were lost to the enemy. But Mihai didn't enjoy his victory for long. Vastly outnumbered, he realizes that he cannot continue a full-scale war against the Ottomans. And, on the very night after the battle, he retreats north into the mountains, where he waits for reinforcements from Sigismund and the Holy League. Meanwhile, Sinan marches further into Wallachia. He occupies Bucharest, Târgoviște, and other major cities, and begins instating the full apparatus of the Ottoman administration, preparing Wallachia for annexation into the empire. But the story doesn't end here. Despite his stunning victory at Kalugăreni, the outnumbered Mihai retreats north, unable to stop Sinan Pasha's advance. The two capitals fall just 3 days after the battle. Wallachia, which had produced so much resistance under Mihai the Brave, looks destined to become an Ottoman province. During centuries of Ottoman domination, Wallachia continued its existence as a political entity through careful management of relations with Constantinople. Wallachian nobility usually avoided an overly aggressive stance towards the Ottoman Empire. In most cases, the voivodes accepted the suzerainty of the Sultan and sought good relations by paying tribute and bribing important officials. But Wallachian voivodes have equally shown that occupying their lands would be met with harsh resistance. And since the principality lacked valuable natural resources, like gold or silver, from the Ottoman perspective, it was more profitable to keep Wallachia as a tax farm than to engage in costly wars and occupation. And, if not overtaxed, as was the case in the years before Mihai's revolt, Wallachia was generally peaceful. And for the Wallachian nobility, the pro-Ottoman policies were a legitimate way to maintain their rule and keep the country free from total occupation, even if vassalized and forced to pay high tributes. But over the centuries, some Wallachian voivodes broke these norms and aggressively sought independence for their people. Mihai was one of them. The Wallachian revolt he led caused a significant disruption to Ottoman lines of communication along the Danube for their main theatre of war against the Holy League in Hungary. As a result, Constantinople moved to dismantle and annex Wallachia in order to fully secure the logistically vital Danube line. Unaffected by the tactical defeat at Kalugăreni, the Ottomans were able to replace their losses and start incorporating Wallachia into the empire. The initial military takeover is swift, as nearly all towns have neither castles nor stone walls. By late August, Ottoman officials are already put in charge over large parts of the country. However, by September, Sinan's preparations for permanent occupation are not going well. The Akinji raiders are plundering and ravaging the country, leading to fierce local resistance and widespread instability. Wallachian rebels clash and defeat several groups of Akinji forces, most notable of which is the massacre of 5,000 raiders near Buzău. Despite these setbacks, it is only a matter of time before the Ottomans have Wallachia firmly in their grip. Having retreated to the Bran Pass, Mihai knows that he needs a second victory to inflict enough losses on the Ottomans if he is to discourage further attacks on Wallachia and maybe seek a political compromise. But in the weeks following the Battle of Kalugăreni, many Wallachian peasants leave his army to defend their homes from Akinji attacks. This significantly weakens his ranks. In addition, the fall of Bucharest and Târgoviște is an indication to the nobility that Mihai had lost the war. Thus, many nobles east of the Olt River see no reason to follow him anymore, and they too withdraw their troops. However, he still enjoys significant support from the nobility in Oltenia, his power base. To make matters worse, despite being immensely wealthy, bankrolling so many mercenaries depleted his funds, and he finds it increasingly difficult to pay for their services. Some leave his army to look for employment elsewhere, but others stay, as finding well-paid employment in the region isn't that easy. because the market is flooded with cheap manpower after the destruction of the countryside and the abandonment of many towns, as well as the ending of the harvest season, left many looking for work. As a result of all these factors, Mihai's army is down to 8,000 men, and the Transylvanian reinforcements can't come soon enough. However, while Vlahia is being pillaged, Sigismund decides to get married before marching south. By forcing Mihai to wait until his wedding is over, Sigismund, perhaps, wants to show who's in charge. But by October, the Transylvanian voivode finally arrives with his army. Help also comes from Moldavia. Stephen Razafan, a highly competent military leader and voivode who is very popular among his men, arrives with his contingent. The three voivodes waste no time. Their combined army numbers around 32,000 men and 100 cannons. It is agreed that Mihai devise a plan for a swift advance, aiming to attack Sinan's position before he can fully organize his army. At this time, Sinan has up to 40,000 combat troops at his disposal, while the rest are dispersed across Vlahia. Armies of the three voivodes advance on Târgoviște. With 40 cannons, the Ottoman garrison offers stiff resistance. Over the next 2 days, much of the town is engulfed in flames during an intense artillery battle. The Ottoman garrison finally retreats, fearing that their storage of gunpowder could explode. But most are eventually killed in the burning city or taken prisoner. All 40 cannons, as well as many supplies and weapons, are taken by the advancing army. Ottoman soldiers that managed to escape report back to Bucharest. Upon learning of the approaching army, Sinan decides to retreat south across the Danube and regroup. Not wanting to leave anything for the advancing enemy, the Ottomans sack and burn Bucharest and blow up the wooden fortifications. He reasons that it would be risky to go against an army of that size, which includes a very strong contingent of heavy cavalry, professional infantry armed with arquebuses and pistols, and nearly 150 artillery pieces. The retreating column is hastily organized. Sinan places himself in the front, along with his advisors, high-ranking officers, and the most valuable troops. The center of the column is rather mixed, while the Akinjis, who are usually fast and agile-moving, form the rear due to being weighed down by plunder and slowed by thousands of slaves that they captured over the past several weeks of raiding. In order to catch the fleeing Ottomans, the three Romanian voivodes pass by Bucharest, sending only a small Moldavian contingent to enter the city and continue marching on the road to Calugăreni and Giurgiu. The two armies finally sight each other. While the Ottomans are crossing the pontoon bridge over the Danube, the three Romanian voivodes appear to the north of Giurgiu. Even before the rest of the column has arrived, the quick-thinking Mihai is the first to attack. Seeing the Ottomans are focused on crossing the river and haven't formed a consistent battle formation, he seizes the initiative and personally leads the charge, urging his men forward. He doesn't want to give the enemy any time to fully form their battle line. The Ottomans amass their plunder and carts to form a barricade in order to slow down the Vlahian charge. Mihai's contingent goes around and over the obstacles and clashes with the Ottoman center and right flank. Sinan's troops on the bridge have no room to maneuver their way back into the battle and can only keep moving forwards across the river. Meanwhile, Transylvanian arquebus infantrymen form up in front of the Ottoman left and begin firing at will. Many are immediately cut down in a hail of bullets. In the center, the Ottoman barricades locked Mihai in a bitter fight against the Akinji cavalry. Nevertheless, the Vlahians slowly push towards the river. Further back, Transylvanian and Vlahian cannons are brought into position, and they open fire on the retreating army. As Sinan and his most valuable troops cross to the other side, the bridge behind them catches fire. Engulfed in flames, many soldiers jump into the river. Minutes later, the damaged bridge collapses, taking with it the unfortunate soldiers, horses and pack animals. Most of them drown in the Danube's strong currents. Across the river, the Akinjis and many others are now cut off, unwilling to let go of the plunder and slaves they had captured, which are slowing them down. In the chaos, some of the horsemen are still trying to retreat across the river, unaware that the bridge had collapsed. By now, they are heavily outnumbered and quickly start suffering massive casualties. After hours of fighting, the Ottomans lost about 3,000 men, while another several thousand were wounded. 6,000 slaves are freed, 150 camels, as well as much of the supplies, weapons and artillery, are left behind. Mihai got his victory. The Battle of Giorgio marked the end of the Ottoman ambition to transform Vlachia into an Ottoman province. Moreover, the battle impacted the fate of the Akinjis as a military institution. The famous horsemen, who had the mission to plunder and weaken enemy territories, were already in decline by the late 16th century. But after the Battle of Giorgio, their operations became minimal, as the style of warfare across Europe began to change. But it's important to note that just as the Akinjis raided Christian lands during peacetime, so too did Christian forces raid Ottoman lands. These raids did not break peace agreements and were practiced by both sides almost every year. This is why the populace that lived in affected areas hated these raiders. And on the battlefield at Giorgio, most of the Vlachian, Moldovan and Transylvanian troops were born and raised in areas that were ravaged by the Akinjis. Needless to say, they hated them and therefore massacred them all, renouncing any ransom. Finally, after hours of fighting, the bridge was cleared and some of the Ottoman troops retreated to the castle of Giorgio, which was attacked on October 19th with 12 cannons of the Toscan artillerymen that were brought closer to the shore. Ottoman ships tried to intervene to stop the bombardment, but were prevented by the Vlachian and Transylvanian artillery. 2 ships were eventually sunk. The Ottoman garrison in the castle made a brave last stand, staving off several assaults while under heavy bombardment. But after hours of fighting, their numbers dwindled, and the castle eventually fell one day later. After the battle, Sinan began planning a general invasion of Vlachia to massacre and displace the population as punishment for their resistance. From a military standpoint, this was a reasonable and effective measure, which was successfully implemented in other problematic regions as well. But Sinan never got the chance to execute his plans. His retreat from Vlachia was regarded as shameful. The man who had masterminded so many victories in Hungary against the Holy League was stripped of his position as Grand Vizier. Across the Danube, Sigismund fulfilled his duty of providing support to Mihai and retreated to Transylvania to avoid keeping his army in the field when the snow falls, as mercenaries and vassals demanded more payment during the winter. Razvan returned to Moldavia, but during his absence, Polish noblemen brought the pro-Ottoman pretender Jeremiah Avila to the throne. Razvan fought to regain the throne, but was defeated. With Jeremiah recognized by the Sultan, Mihai became threatened by a potential Moldavian military intervention. Conflict seemed inevitable, and the war with the Ottomans also continued. But Vlachia was mostly in ruins. Many peasants fled, leaving some areas depopulated. Towns suffered massive damage. This made the collection of taxes very difficult, which further worsened Mihai's financial situation. In order to start rebuilding the economy, the fortress of Brela was attacked and conquered. As one of the most important ports on the Danube, Brela immediately alleviated some of Mihai's financial problems, thanks to the highly valuable commercial taxation. In addition, by controlling Brela, Mihai gained a strategically important position against Moldavia. He could attack and then retreat to the fortress, while Moldavia had no fortresses in the south of the country. All of them were dismantled on the orders of the Sultan. Ottomans responded by sending Tatar raiders into Vlachia to attack Târgoviște. Although they had the element of surprise, the Tatars only had a narrow corridor to go through, and their movement was easy to predict. Mihai intercepted and destroyed their army. Meanwhile, another operation was launched in the west to take the fortress of Vidin, while Mihai marched south to conquer the fortress of Nicopolis. During spring, Mihai had to dismiss many of his mercenaries, as he couldn't pay them due to a lack of taxes and insufficient plunder, and he began relying on Serbian and Bulgarian haiduks to bolster his ranks. Operations across all of northern Bulgaria continued throughout the summer of 1596, causing massive economic damage. Another Tatar army was ordered to pass through Vlachia and join the Ottoman army in Hungary. The Tatars sacked Buzău, Gherghita and Bucharest, but were defeated and chased over the Danube into Dobruja. Meanwhile, Mehmed III dealt a massive defeat to a combined Austrian and Transylvanian army in the Battle of Mezőkeresztes. Two more Transylvanian attacks were repelled on the fortress of Lipova and Timișoara, which were key for controlling the Banat region. Shaken by these defeats, Austria and Transylvania looked to negotiate a truce. The break in hostilities opened up a possibility for a major Ottoman invasion of Vlachia, and Mihai scrambled to get more troops to prepare for a possible attack. To raise funds for new troops, Mihai introduced dreadfully harsh measures. He essentially enslaved his own population by forbidding all classes of serfs from leaving the estates on which they worked. This gave the boyars immense power over the serfs that worked their land, and they imposed taxes higher than ever on the peasants in order to make the high payments to the voivode. These measures may have been a pragmatic way to defend Vlachia, but they squeezed the life out of the country's poorest people. And although Mihai's reputation was high because of his spectacular victories against the Ottomans, these measures diminished his popularity among his people. And in addition to heavily taxing his people, the voivode sent a delegation to Rudolf II, asking him to pay for 4,000 mercenaries from imperial coffers to help fight the Ottomans. The emperor agreed, seeing this as an opportunity to take away some of the pressure from Austria and shift the fighting into Vlachia and northern Bulgaria. Another hope was that Mihai would be able to push back the Ottomans and motivate Bulgarians, Serbians and Albanians to revolt. Mihai now had a standing army of around 13,000 fighting men, and he resumed his attacks all along the Danube. The devastation of the countryside, roads and infrastructure was so severe that the bigger towns and cities in northern Bulgaria became completely isolated and cut off from the rest of the empire. Furthermore, he transported some 16,000 Christian Bulgarian peasants into Vlachia, whom he provided with land, aiming to increase his tax base. But in his rear, Voivode Jeremiah and his nobles were planning to overthrow and replace him with a pretender by the name of Simon, Jeremiah's younger brother. To make matters worse, Sigismund abdicated the Transylvanian throne due to many internal and external problems. Mihai made another proposition to Rudolf II, the unification of Transylvania and Vlachia under Mihai's rule, in order to continue the war against the Ottomans with the help of Transylvania's resources. Rudolf refused and began planning to seize Transylvania for himself. Surrounded on all sides, Mihai was forced to seek peace with the Ottomans. He took advantage of his successes on the battlefield and the mass destruction he caused in Bulgaria to gain favorable terms. He kept the fortresses on the Danube and was recognized by the Sultan as the ruler of Vlachia. The Vlachian voivode was now free to deal with his Christian enemies in order to secure his country.
It's late in the year 1599. Having signed a peace treaty with the Ottoman Empire, Mihai gained control of all fortifications on the Wallachian side of the Danube and was recognized by the Sultan as voivode of Wallachia. But despite these favorable peace terms that secured Mihai's southern border, trouble was brewing in the north. The scheming rulers of Transylvania and Moldavia were plotting to overthrow the Wallachian voivode. It was then that Mihai laid out his political plan of unifying the three principalities under his rule. As he allowed his army to regain strength after several months of campaigning, Mihai knew that the issue with the Ottomans was far from settled. However, the peace treaty allowed him enough time to address a growing problem to the north. The election of Andrew Bathory as Prince of Transylvania after his cousin Sigismund abdicated was most unfavorable for Mihai. With the new prince enjoying support from Poland, Transylvania slipped into the sphere of influence of the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, which in turn was friendly towards the Ottoman Empire. Seeking to impose suzerainty over the three Carpathian principalities, Andrew first arranged a marriage between his half-brother and a daughter of Jeremiah Movia, who was part of the pro-Polish party already ruling in Moldavia. This made the principality a vassal of Poland, whilst also being under suzerainty of Transylvania and paying tribute to Constantinople, all at the same time. This concept is known as condominium, a territory ruled by two or more sovereign powers. After securing Moldavia, Andrew then entered negotiations with the Ottoman Empire, asking for the confirmation of his hereditary rule and suzerainty over Wallachia, and began plotting to install a pretender, Jeremiah's younger brother Simeon Movia, on the Wallachian throne. The Ottomans supported this policy, deeming Mihai a dangerous opponent. If he were removed from power, it would be much easier for the Sultan to put a new pro-Ottoman voivode on the throne as a political puppet, who would again pay tribute and return all fortifications along the Danube to the Ottomans. Mihai now found himself surrounded by rulers who viewed him as a dangerous political obstacle, and it was in their political and economic interest to replace him. To offset an invasion from Transylvania and Moldavia that was certainly coming, the wily Wallachian voivode cunningly swore fealty to Andrew, which gave him time to make preparations of his own. A host of 13,000 troops was ordered to gather at Târgoviște, including 4,000 experienced mercenaries and haiduks, mostly Serbians, Bulgarians, and Albanians. Mihai then turned to Vienna to negotiate the much-needed political backing from Rudolf II, which gave his plan to invade Transylvania considerable legitimacy. The Holy Roman Emperor hadn't acknowledged Andrew's rule, and it was in his interest to help the Wallachian voivode's invasion, seeing it as a chance to regain suzerainty over Transylvania for the House of Habsburg. In the east, Mihai created the Banat of Bazou and Brela, and assigned a band to keep an eye and react to any activity on the Moldavian border. Then, during the first week of October, a messenger came from Transylvania, presenting a highly provocative and insolent ultimatum. By the power of his overlordship over Wallachia, Andrew Bathory ordered Mihai to take his entire family and leave the country. The Wallachian voivode simply sent the messenger on his way without a reply. There would be war. Before the messenger could return to Andrew, Mihai already set off with his army from Târgoviște. In order to secure his back, the Wallachian voivode bribed Ottoman officials in Constantinople and moved through the Buzău Pass over the mountains. In choosing this route, he hoped to convince the Szekelys to join him against Andrew Bathory, who had stripped them of their old privileges. Declaring that he is attacking Transylvania on behalf of Rudolf II, and with the promise to have their freedoms restored, several thousand Szekely troops and a contingent of artillery came to Mihai's banner. Further military aid came from the Transylvanian Saxons, and reinforcements arrived from Oltenia, Mihai's power base. His army, now numbering around 20,000 men, marched towards the fortified city of Sibiu. The city was a highly important strategic point from where the rest of Transylvania could be controlled. To protect it from falling into Wallachian hands, Andrew drew up in front of the city walls an army around 16,000 strong, and waited for Mihai. Neither of the two armies got much sleep during the early hours of October 18th. The rain turned and stirred up ground in both camps into a sticky quagmire, and the howling cold mountain wind swept down across the flat plain. But finally, some hours after daybreak, the miserable weather cleared, and the ground hardened under the warm morning sun, as the two armies arrayed opposite each other just south of Sibiu, near the village of Shelimbar. Out from the Transylvanian ranks rode out a figure with the papal standard above him. It was a diplomat by the name of Malaspina. On the behest of Andrew Bathory, he tried to exert his authority as a papal representative to convince Mihai to retreat. But the Wallachian voivode refused. Incredibly, despite facing the Wallachian army across the field, Andrew was still confident he could negotiate Mihai's abdication and impose himself as the ruler of Wallachia. He only really took Mihai's military preparations seriously when Malaspina came back with a negative answer. At around 9 o'clock in the morning, the battle began with an intense exchange of artillery fire. Mihai's 18 guns, although of higher caliber, initially had the wrong shot and were ineffective. Andrew, meanwhile, unleashed his 50 guns. He tried to overwhelm the Wallachians with repeated massive volleys of cannon fire. However, when he arrayed his army earlier in the day, Mihai ordered his troops to spread out, anticipating a heavy bombardment from the numerically superior Transylvanian artillery, thereby minimizing losses from enemy fire. In contrast, Andrew arrayed his troops shoulder to shoulder in a typical battle formation, and once Mihai's guns switched to the correct shot, the Wallachian artillery fire tore through the Transylvanian ranks. The stark contrast in leadership capabilities started to become evident, as Mihai's 18 guns outmatched the 50 cannon Andrew had at his disposal. The Transylvanian prince took heavy losses, with many of his densely packed troops killed and maimed in the artillery exchange. A light rain finally halted the prolonged bombardment, and Mihai took the initiative straight away. On the left, he ordered Starina Novak to lead the attack with his experienced Serbian mercenaries and Haiduks, along with Hungarian and Cossack mercenaries on the left wing, commanded by the Ban of Oltenia. On the right, Aga Leka led contingents of Serbians and Moldavians on a delayed charge, while the Wallachians followed in the second line. Mihai slowly advanced with the reserve, formed by his personal retinue, court troops and another contingent of Cossacks. Seeing the onrushing Starina Novak, Andrew's right braced for impact. Mihai tasked the Serbian mercenaries with punching through the enemy line. But the Transylvanian troops briefly held the enemy from breaking through and managed to keep their formation, although they gradually gave ground. On the other side of the battlefield, the fighting line shifted back and forth as the savage stalemate dragged on for a couple of hours. Nevertheless, the Transylvanian line held. On the left, Mihai's reliance on Starina Novak paid off, as the unrelenting push of Serbian shock troops carved open the enemy line. Hungarian mounted units poured through the opening, as the Transylvanian prince failed to react in time to plug the gap. But one of Andrew's captains, Gaspar Cornish, took the initiative and surged forward with his contingent. His quick reaction stabilized the line, all but halting Starina Novak's push. By now the battle entered its third hour. Mihai's exhausted troops on the left could not withstand the fresh enemy reinforcements, and they fell back. Gaspar spurred the men on across the entire battle line to push forward. The Transylvanian counterattack had begun. Some of the Hungarian noblemen at Andrew's side began to cheer, thinking that they had the enemy on the run. Mihai sprang into action, seeing that the second line of Wallachian infantry wasn't able to stem the tide. He knew that the fighting retreat of his troops could turn into a rout at any moment. Personally leading the charge, the Wallachian voivode slammed into Gaspar's contingent with his personal retinue and the Cossacks. He signaled his court troops to wheel about and focused his own attack on pinning down Gaspar's best troops in close quarters to prevent them from covering the flank. Meanwhile, on the Wallachian right, Aga Leka was finding it increasingly difficult to keep his troops in line as gaps began opening up between Moldavian contingents. But as Mihai's court troops swung around the enemy line, Transylvanian troops on the right lost heart and began fleeing to avoid being enveloped. Instead of trying to rally the troops, Andrew Bathory fled the field with his retinue. The retreat caused a chain reaction, and soon the rest of the army followed. During the subsequent pursuit, Mihai's troops killed several thousand enemy troops, taking many prominent nobles prisoner, among them Gaspar Cornish. News of the defeat quickly reached the Transylvanian capital. The nobility met to decide their next course of action, and when Mihai triumphantly entered the city a few days later, they elected the Wallachian voivode as the Prince of Transylvania. 2 days later, the new ruler assembled the Transylvanian Diet, demanding that the estates swear loyalty to Emperor Rudolf, then to himself and to his son. He now began calling himself King of Transylvania and Wallachia. Meanwhile, Andrew's troops dispersed to avoid the wrath of the Wallachians. With his army in tatters, the dethroned prince fled northeast with only a handful of followers, intending to cross into Moldavia, where he hoped to receive support. However, as he entered one of the Carpathian mountain passes, Sekeli shepherds recognized and killed him in an ambush. Mihai knew that Andrew's unexpected demise was most fortunate, for had he managed to cross the mountains, the support from Moldavia and Poland would have been enough to attempt to retake the throne of Transylvania. And it was clear to Mihai that, with Poland's backing, Jeremiah's scheming diplomatic and military opposition would continue to pose a serious threat to his rule. Seeing no other way than to overthrow the Moldavian voivode, Mihai began planning an invasion. He met with Polish envoys to begin negotiations, whereby he would recognize the Polish king as his sovereign in exchange for the Moldavian crown and the recognition of hereditary rights of his male heirs over the three principalities. Negotiations weren't fruitful, but on the 14th of April 1600, his troops nevertheless entered Moldavia. The invasion was met with only minor resistance, as Jeremiah was caught completely by surprise. Before even attempting to mount a resistance, he fled north with his followers. The fast conquest was facilitated by the fact that, due to the Ottoman ban on building defenses, Moldavia did not have any fortresses that could slow down the invading army, with the exception of the Hotin fortress in the north. But the cause for the fast breakdown of Jeremiah's rule was the dissatisfaction of the Moldavian army, with many troops simply deserting him. Within 3 weeks, Mihai caught up with him at Hotin. In the castle, Movia took refuge with his family and a handful of boyars. Much like the majority of the troops throughout the country, the Moldavian soldiers in the fortress deserted and joined Mihai. Left with only a small Polish garrison, on June 11th, Jeremiah snuck out of Hotin under the cover of darkness. Mihai's warring ways united for the first time the principalities of Wallachia, Transylvania, and Moldavia under a Romanian ruler. But a new dynasty controlling this new and potentially powerful kingdom has upset the balance of power in the region. The neighboring states were bound to interfere, and Mihai would soon face the enormous challenge of keeping his young kingdom together. It's a warm September morning. The town of Miroslav is abuzz as Mihai's soldiers haggle and barter for provisions at the local market. But the flurry of activity is interrupted when scouts return with news that a more numerous and better equipped army is just a few kilometers east. On a hill just outside the town, the new king of Wallachia, Transylvania, and Moldavia stands confidently as his troops get into position. The battle that's about to take place will decide the fate of his kingdom. By first securing Wallachia's safety against the Ottomans, and then incorporating Transylvania and Moldavia into his new kingdom, Mihai proved he was a quick-thinking general who mastered all of the basics of 16th century warfare. He understood the advantages of speed and flanking, attacking an enemy formation from two sides, and he knew how to use the terrain to his advantage. The kingdom Mihai founded did not yet have a national agenda, and still wasn't based on ethnical unity. Rather, by unifying Wallachia, Transylvania, and Moldavia, it is likely that he wanted to establish a new Wallachian monarchy with himself as king, and his dynasty, the Wallachian nobility from his power base in Oltenia, and Wallachian Orthodox clerics as the ruling elite. And while it is somewhat unclear what the name of this new kingdom would have been, it is clear that this was a project of Wallachian elites to expand their power over the neighboring principalities. But straight away, Mihai's ambitious plans were met with external and internal threats. Externally, the interests of the three neighboring great powers were damaged by Mihai's unification. The Habsburg monarchy wanted control over Transylvania's resources and rich economy. The Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth wanted Moldavia as their buffer state. while the Ottoman Empire wanted to restore their control over all three principalities. This placed Mihai's kingdom under great threat of foreign intervention, which was amplified by the fact that Wallachia and Moldavia had almost no fortifications or castles, since the Ottomans previously forbade their construction in order to weaken their rulers. In the event of a defeat on the battlefield, there would be no well-fortified cities that could delay an invading army for weeks or even months. Instead, an attacking enemy could quickly penetrate deep into Moldavia and Wallachia in a matter of days. To make matters worse, Mihai's relationship with Rudolf became strained. Although he acknowledged Habsburg overlordship, Mihai began calling himself king and continued to negotiate his official position in Transylvania. Namely, he wanted direct rule instead of being governor in Rudolf's name, and equally claimed the Partium region as the rightful part of his new kingdom. This damaged Mihai's diplomatic reputation, and seeing that he virtually lost the support of his only major ally, all three great powers quietly began preparing military interventions against his young realm. Internally, Mihai knew that if he could stabilize the country by integrating the elites of Transylvania and Moldavia, the monarchy would have disposed of considerable economic and military resources, and could become a new, powerful player in the region, capable of resisting Austrian, Polish, and Ottoman interventions. But domestically, he faced yet more problems. He partially merged the Wallachian and Transylvanian councils, although the two governments remained separate, as Mihai did not want to disrupt the successful model of Transylvania's system of government. Moreover, he invited Szekely and other Transylvanian Hungarians to assist in the administration of Wallachia, intending to incorporate Transylvania's far more advanced feudal system. Measures like forbidding drudgery for Orthodox priests shows that Mihai aimed at winning over the elites. In addition, he forced the Transylvanian Diet to relieve Orthodox priests of feudal obligations, much to the Diet's dismay, and gave the Orthodox Church from Wallachia official authority over the Romanian population living in Transylvania, which took more power away from the Diet, causing further frustration. Adding to the tension, in Alba Iulia he founded a new Orthodox metropolis and built a church there. It is very likely that he wanted to gain support of the Orthodox Church hierarchy, and maybe also their financial help. However, he never tried to improve the situation of the Romanian population in Transylvania, which were mostly peasants, many of whom were serfs, as it was fiscally advantageous to continue the present situation in order to help fill the state's coffers. Moreover, Mihai even supported the Hungarian nobility in crushing any and all uprisings that would threaten the tax income of the kingdom. The struggling peasants sent numerous delegations to his court, asking for the revocation of some of the harsh measures. But taxation was nevertheless increased more than 500% virtually overnight, from a fixed 3 florins per family before his reign to 16 florins plus obligatory food deliveries for the army. Unable to pay, many desperate peasants entered into Mihai's service as mercenaries or simply fled the lands of their lords, which frustrated Hungarian nobles who lost significant tax revenue. Meanwhile, the Szekely's got back their privileges, but the Saxon townspeople were displeased with being forced to provide their ruler with considerable financial loans. The situation in Moldavia was far worse, where local nobles and peasants grew increasingly unhappy as some of Mihai's unpaid mercenaries plundered the land with impunity. With the conquest of Transylvania and Moldavia complete, Mihai's mercenary army again became an unsustainable financial burden, as there were no new military campaigns to be had that could yield the plunder needed to pay the troops. And although the kingdom possessed enough manpower to field a 60,000-strong army, Mihai could currently mobilize only around 15,000 troops, due to the unstable economy and taxation system in these early stages of his reign. Therefore, to protect the kingdom, he had to rely heavily on mercenaries, which he could no longer afford. He attempted to solve the problem by awarding several seized Transylvanian castles and important political positions to mercenary commanders with whom he developed close relationships, as compensation for not being able to pay them and their troops. These commanders and their troops were mostly from Serbia, Bulgaria, and Albania, and they essentially became mercenary warlords who freely oppressed sections of the local nobility and peasantry. Widespread corruption and extortion flourished under their local rule, sowing the seeds of resistance across Transylvania and Moldavia. The Hungarian nobility undertook a revolt to overthrow Mihai with the support from the Habsburg army, commanded by an Italian general, Giorgio Basta. The rebel army marched on the Transylvanian capital, but was soon intercepted. Although the political situation in Transylvania deteriorated significantly over the last several months, the nobles retained most of their power and were content to accept Mihai as their ruler. But what sparked the revolt were widespread false rumors that Mihai planned to nullify the status of Transylvanian noblemen and turn their estates over to the Wallachian nobility. Due to these rumors, any negotiations were out of the question, and now Mihai watched as the enemy column entered the valley north of the Mureș River. General Basta led the imperial troops, supported by the Hungarian nobility of Transylvania, as well as Austrian and Saxon troops, Flemish knights, as well as contingents of Walloons, French musketeers, artillery and mercenaries. With around 20,000 troops under his command, Basta had both a substantial numerical advantage and the element of surprise. The sudden and unexpected revolt didn't allow Mihai enough time to assemble his army. Most of his mercenaries were late for the battle, with only Starina Novak appearing with a small portion of his Serbian cavalry, along with a contingent of Cossacks and Sekalis. With only 12,000 troops, and without his best units, Mihai knew that the quality of his troops was inferior to those under Basta's command, and he tried to offset his numerical inferiority by forming a defensive line between the Mureș River and the hills, fortified with ditches and barricades. The Italian general moved into position where his artillery would have range, and he positioned his best cavalry in the second line, planning to unleash them as soon as cannon fire softened the enemy line. Artillery opened the engagement. For a time, the bombardment was equally effective on both sides. But then, Mihai gave the signal, and a thundering roar echoed from the hills above. Basta seemed stunned as enemy cannons rained down on his position. Hungarian troops closest to the hillside and his artillery contingent immediately took heavy losses. The cavalry in the front apparently began wavering, and Basta ordered them to pull back, realizing he would not be able to dislodge the defenders. With victory seemingly within grasp, Mihai charged after the enemy. Subsequently, the rest of Basta's army began retreating. The cavalry slowly began overtaking the infantry, wanting to get out of range of cannon fire. In battles during this period, most of the casualties were inflicted during the pursuit of the fleeing army. Needless to say, Mihai's men went on an extensive pursuit, sensing the weakness of Basta's troops. But after getting well out of range of the Wallachian artillery, Basta abruptly stopped. A flurry of orders and signals were sent out. His cavalry wheeled about, and the infantry took up a defensive formation. What first seemed like a rout turned out to be a feigned retreat. Mihai was in trouble. With his infantry lagging behind, he was caught in the middle of the open valley. The more numerous, better equipped and more experienced enemy cavalry bore down on his flanks, while the Italian led a frontal infantry charge. The cohesion of the Cossacks on the right was quickly broken by the charge of Basta's heavy cavalry, and they began fleeing the field. Mihai stood defiantly in the face of enemy musket fire, but it was not enough to turn the tide, and the collapse of his right flank eventually caused a complete rout. Secoli soldiers surrendered after being assured that they will be set free. However, Basta would later have them all killed. The defeat was catastrophic. 4,000 of Mihai's troops perished, and he himself escaped on his horse, swimming across the Mureș River. It is not fully clear why such a proven commander fell into the trap of a feigned retreat. Overconfidence is often suggested as the reason why Mihai gambled away his winning position at Miroslav. Another possibility is that, because his kingdom was threatened on all sides, he understood that he needed to inflict as many losses on the enemy and achieve a quick victory in order to deal with threats arising elsewhere. Whatever the case, the fallout of this defeat would soon cause panic within Mihai's regime. But despite being forced to retreat into the mountains, the cunning Wallachian would live to fight another day. The sun rose above the thatched roofs of Guruslo as the narrow town streets came to life on early morning of August 3rd, 1601. To the sound of church bells, the craftsmen opened their shops for customers. The town crier's public announcements echoed on the town square. The traders called out their wares on the local marketplace, and the main street was awash with the smell of hot sheep's feet and beef ribs coming from the fast food stands. But then, around 9 o'clock, the pleasant morning routine was interrupted. There was little doubt that the thundering noise coming from across the hill was artillery fire. After the defeat at Miroslav, Mihai rushed back across the mountains to regroup. As he led some 7,000 survivors back through the Buzău Pass, messengers rode forward, carrying orders for the nobles to assemble their armies after receiving word that Jan Zamoyski, the Chancellor of the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, marched into Moldavia with an army of 17,000 troops and 10 artillery pieces, bringing with him the brothers Jeremiah and Simeon Movia, with the goal of overthrowing Mihai's rule in Moldavia and Wallachia. Many Moldavian nobles and peasants, unhappy with Mihai's rule, joined the invaders, further swelling Zamoyski's ranks. The Polish-Moldavian army expelled Mihai's officials in Iași. Jeremiah Movia was reinstated as the voivode of Moldavia, and Zamoyski spent the rest of the month securing the loyalty of the nobility in the northern part of the principality, in order to stabilize Jeremiah's rule and put Moldavia's administration back in sync with the Commonwealth. Then, on October the 1st, the Polish-Moldavian host continued towards the Wallachian frontier. The lack of fortifications and castles enabled a quick advance south, and the local nobility had little choice but to join the advancing army, lest they be stripped of their lands and political power. On October the 10th, Zamoyski entered and occupied Buzău. Mihai promptly marched against them, but he managed to muster a force of around only 10,000 troops. Outnumbered almost 2-1, and without any artillery, he was defeated on October the 20th by a larger and better equipped Polish-Moldavian army. Zamoyski launched extensive pursuits, aiming to further dismantle Mihai's remaining forces as the invading host continued south. As the Wallachian army retreated towards Oltenia, Zamoyska reached Bucharest. Simeon Movia was put on the throne of Wallachia with orders to pay a tribute of 40,000 florins per year to the Polish crown, significantly spreading the Commonwealth's sphere of influence in the region. Meanwhile, Mihai spent the next month preparing for a counteroffensive and moved to reclaim the throne of Wallachia in late November. But the hastily assembled army was a far cry from the one that brought him victories against the Ottomans and during the unification of Wallachia, Transylvania, and Moldavia. In late November, he crossed the river Olt, only to be defeated again, losing some of his most important commanders. The defeat at Curtea de Argeș prevented him from taking a strategically important position that allows access into Transylvania through 3 mountain passes, accessible to marching armies. The most important nobles finally left him, and his troops scattered. Realizing that he had no chance of retaking Wallachia on his own, Mihai made the hard decision to leave his homeland and head for Vienna. The grueling and dangerous journey lasted over 30 days, and he arrived in Vienna in mid-January. However, Emperor Rudolf refused to give him an audience at his court. But because of the volatile situation in Transylvania, the emperor was unsure on how to approach the matter. Basta's governorship faced significant difficulties in handling the Transylvanian nobility, and although Rudolf hoped that the situation would stabilize, now he had Mihai as a possible alternative in case the political turmoil escalated. Forced to wait for several weeks, Mihai got his chance when the Transylvanian Diet revolted against Basta, forcing him into exile. The nobleman decided to reinstate Sigismund Bathory, who turned his back on Rudolf and was now loyal to the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, having received from them substantial military support. Mihai's followers were promptly persecuted across Transylvania and severely punished. Starina Novak, one of his most outstanding commanders, was burned alive for nearly 2 hours, and then impaled while still alive. With the situation in Transylvania deteriorating fast, Rudolf reacted. 100,000 florins were provided to Mihai to build a new army, formed by Serbian, Cossack and Silesian mercenaries, which quickly reached 10,000 troops. Another 10,000-strong army was commanded by Basta. The emperor ordered his 2 commanders to set their differences aside, and the united army marched from Satu Mare into Transylvania. Sigismund, meanwhile, marched to meet them. The size of the prince's army isn't fully known, but according to certain sources it was about 40,000 strong, consisting of Hungarian noblemen, Moldavians, Cossacks, and Polish troops. On August the 3rd, the 2 armies met at the town of Burislav. Looking at the army that arrayed across the valley, Sigismund Bathory was understandably confident. Basta led around 5,000 cavalry and 5,000 infantry, while Mihai commanded 4,000 cavalry and 6,000 infantry. All told, their army of some 20,000, supported by an artillery contingent, seemed no match for the host commanded by the Transylvanian prince. Then, with a wave of a hand, Sigismund ordered his 40,000 troops to advance. Keeping their formation, the infantry and cavalry kept a slow pace, allowing the artillery to get into a firing position. At around 9 o'clock in the morning, the battle started with an artillery duel. The prolonged and ineffective cannonade was interrupted when Bathory ordered a massive cavalry attack along the entire line, wishing to come down hard on the outnumbered enemy. Transylvanian infantry and artillery followed behind, as the cavalry steamed towards Mihai's and Basta's line. But what Sigismund failed to notice was a steep grassy slope, up to a meter tall in some places, running across almost the entire battlefield. Prior to the battle, Mihai knew that this small slope would be vital for the outcome of the battle, and on his suggestion, the army lined up behind it. Now, as Bathory's cavalry was closing in, Mihai gave the signal, and the entire line moved to take up position along the edge of the slope. As he predicted, the momentum of the cavalry was broken by the slope, helping the infantry in the center cope with the impact of the charge. Initially, Sigismund's cavalry proved their mettle, inflicting significant losses on the enemy. But as jabs were traded back and forth, the infantry in the center held. However, all this changed once the Transylvanian infantry joined the fighting. The sheer mass of Bathory's men pushed back Mihai's and Basta's line, and slowly began grinding down their numbers in a lopsided standoff. From the suffocating crush in the front of the fighting, the screams of men echoed across the narrow valley. Sensing that the tide will turn against them if this battle of attrition continued for any longer, Mihai made a decisive move. Personally taking command of the second line of his cavalry, he turned to maneuver his way around Sigismund's left flank. He ordered his artillerymen to position the cannons closer to the fighting and fire at will. The cannon volleys helped support the under-pressure cavalry in the first line and create as much chaos on Bathory's left in order to help cover Mihai's flanking maneuver. Sigismund reacted by ordering his own cannons to get into position to counter the enemy artillery fire, and sent the reserves to bolster the attack on his left. But as the reinforcements rushed forward, the men became spread out, and the speed of the Wallachian charge caught them out before they could consolidate. Leading from the front, Mihai ploughed into the Transylvanians from the left, his cavalrymen trampling enemy soldiers as the gaps in their formation afforded his horsemen plenty of room to maneuver. Sigismund's reserves that were sent to support the front line routed soon after. Seeing the chaotic retreat in front of them, artillerymen also abandoned their posts. As the Wallachian cavalry struck the rear of Bathory's troops in the front, it became evident that Mihai's charge would decide the battle, as the surrounded Transylvanian troops began running for their lives. Having lost around 10,000 men, and with all of his cannons captured, Sigismund Bathory had no choice but to withdraw from the field. With Sigismund's army scattered, Mihai marched ahead and reached Cluj, where he planted a flag in honor of his captain Starina Novak, who was executed by the Hungarian nobleman. According to orders issued by Emperor Rudolf, Mihai was to continue on into Wallachia to retake the throne. This was made easier by the fact that his supporters, led by the ever-loyal Buzescu family, had already overthrown Simeon Movia and sent messages to Mihai that they awaited his arrival in Târgoviște. However, Mihai wanted to separate himself from Basta and occupy Alba Iulia as his princely seat, directly against Emperor Rudolf's wishes. Needless to say, it was unacceptable for the Habsburgs to allow Mihai to rule over a potentially powerful kingdom, and the emperor put in motion a plot against his life. On Rudolf's behest, Basta sent his men in the morning of August 9th, 1601, to Mihai's camp. When he tried to defend himself, he was struck down with halberds and his head cut off. His body was left to lay in the field for some time, but his followers managed to bring his head back to Wallachia, to a monastery overlooking the former capital, Târgoviște, from a hill, where it is still today. Mihai's defeat was more a political than a military one. He tried to impose the rule of his Wallachian party in Transylvania and Moldavia over the power structures already established by the local nobility. This caused significant resistance and finally led to his downfall. It seems that he thought too much on a military level, using his army as the answer to the demands of his rule. In addition, the outside pressures proved too much, as the strong monarchy that Mihai tried to create presented a problem for the three major powers. For Austria and Poland in particular, it was strategically much more favorable to keep Wallachia and Moldavia as weak buffer states with exchangeable voivodes, who easily agreed to pay tribute and served to absorb potential invasions from the Ottoman Empire. It was also a question of prestige for these powers to be the overlords of the three principalities and not equals to a potentially strong leader like Mihai the Brave, ruling a powerful kingdom. But his brief unification of Wallachia, Transylvania and Moldavia would go on to form the foundation of the Romanian national identity. Special thanks to Professor Albert Weber and his team for translating contemporary documents from Turkish, Bulgarian, Romanian, Hungarian, Venetian and Papal sources into English, providing unique information that enabled us to create this mini-series. If you'd like to learn about Romanian medieval history, make sure to check out their books. Credit goes to our awesome patrons who make videos like this one possible. Consider joining them to support our work. You can also support us by subscribing to our channel and clicking the bell button to get notified when our new videos are released. And as always, thank you for watching.